The biting cold stung Catherine Ashford's face as she staggered into the general store in Timber Creek, Colorado. Snow whipped across the empty street behind her, filling the air with a blinding white haze. Her breath came in ragged gasps, turning to mist before it could escape her lips. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her father's old revolver still hot in her trembling hands. But it was not the gun that haunted her. It was the blood, dark, congealed, and now frozen against her skin like a brand. 3 hours ago, she had killed a man. His name was Jacob Murdoch, but calling him a man seemed too generous. He had been the one to take her father's life, and after that, he had tried to take their ranch with forged papers and threats. The law wouldn't care about the reason. Women didn't shoot men, even in self-defense. Not in this world. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside, the warm air of the store mixing with the chill she had carried in. She felt the weight of eyes on her before she could even see them. Strangers, old faces that had watched her grow up, and now they all knew what she had done. "Help you, miss?" The voice was thin and distant, as if it came from a world she no longer belonged to. Catherine shook herself free of the fog that threatened to pull her under. She straightened her shoulders, forcing her spine to stay rigid, though the weight of her guilt threatened to bend her. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. Not here. "I need supplies," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Food, blankets, ammunition." Her eyes flitted over the store's shelves, taking in what she needed but not seeing it. "Quickly, please." The shopkeeper took a long look at her, his gaze narrowing as he processed the sight before him. Catherine knew she must look a sight. Her hair had come undone in the ride, her dress torn at the hem, the remnants of blood staining her hands. He said nothing, just turned, collecting the things she had asked for, arranging them neatly on the counter. "That'll be $7, he said at last, his voice flat. She dug through her worn purse, counting out the coins with shaking fingers. The ranch had been her father's pride, his life's work. Now, Jacob's brother would take it, if the law had its way. She hadn't expected it to end like this. The law would never see it as justice, not for a woman. Her heart clenched in her chest as she handed over the money. The storekeeper gave a tight nod, and she grabbed her supplies, her boots scraping the dusty wooden floor. Outside, snowflakes began to fall again. Large and wet, the kind that would cover her tracks and give her a few hours, head start before they found her. Before they knew what she had done, she swung herself onto her father's horse, Thunder. The same horse that had carried him through so many winters and guided him down the trail. The snow was starting to accumulate, thickening with each minute that passed. She had to reach the mountain passes before they closed for the season. She had to get into the wilderness, somewhere she could disappear where the law couldn't follow. The cold air stung her face as she urged Thunder onward, the heavy weight of her supplies and the gun in her holster pulling at her shoulders. She barely noticed the biting wind, the snow stinging her cheeks. Behind her, she knew Samuel Murdoch would be finding his brother's body, and Catherine's world would be unrecognizable. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, darkness crept across the snow-covered landscape, and the storm picked up in earnest. Snow whipped around her, heavy flakes driven sideways by the wind until Thunder's ears were barely visible in front of her. Catherine's fingers had long since gone numb. Her cheeks burned with the cold, and still she pressed forward. She had grown up in these mountains, had ridden through their trails with her father, but this storm was unlike anything she had ever faced. The cold seeped through her bones, a bitter reminder of how small she was in the face of nature's fury. Thunder stumbled on the trail, almost throwing her, and Catherine's heart skipped a beat. She fought the urge to panic. The last thing she needed was to be thrown in this storm with no shelter. She remembered a line shack. It had been years since her father had mentioned it, but she knew it was somewhere along the trail. A small shelter he had once pointed out on a summer ride. The thought of it sent a flicker of hope through her chest, and she guided Thunder off the main trail, trusting the horse's instincts. Time seemed to blur. She rode through the storm, not sure whether it had been minutes or hours, Snow blinded her, and she fought to stay upright, gripping Thunder's reins with frozen fingers. But then, through the swirling whiteness, a dark shape emerged. The line shack. It was small and weathered but still standing, a beacon of survival in the storm. Catherine's legs barely held her weight as she slid off the saddle, her hands shaking as she led Thunder to the lean-to beside the shack. She rubbed the horse down with both blankets she had brought, her movements jerky with cold, but she knew the animal's survival was as important as her own. Inside the shack, Catherine found enough dry wood to start a fire, though her frozen fingers could barely strike the match. When the fire finally caught, she collapsed near the hearth, feeling the circulation return to her limbs with painful tingling. She should have eaten. She should have planned her next move, but exhaustion pulled her under, and with her father's revolver clutched in her hand, she fell into a restless sleep, haunted by the night's events. The wind howled around the shack, and the fire burned low. Outside, the storm raged on, but for now, Catherine was safe. She had survived one more night. Catherine awoke to the shrieking wind outside, rattling the shack as snow poured through the smallest gaps in the walls. The fire had burned low, leaving only the crackle of embers in the hearth to break the silence. She could hear Thunder shifting outside, his hooves tapping against the cold earth, and the steady thrum of her own heartbeat in her ears. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had worsened overnight. The world beyond the shack was a blur of swirling white, unfamiliar, dangerous, a landscape she had known since childhood, but now felt alien in the snow's relentless grip. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and Catherine knew that if she didn't leave soon, the weather would trap her here until it was too late. She pushed herself upright, her muscles sore from the cold and the exhaustion of the previous night. Her coat was still damp, her hands still trembling. But she had no time to waste. Samuel Murdoch's men would be looking for her, if they weren't already on her trail, and the storm would cover her tracks for only so long. She needed to move, to keep ahead of them, to get to the mountain passes before they sealed shut for winter. Catherine forced herself to stand, the world spinning for a moment as her legs protested. She checked on Thunder, who stood quietly by the lean-to, his head lowered. She had enough food to last a few days if she rationed carefully, but she wasn't sure how long the storm would last. She had to stay one step ahead of the law. There was no time to think, no time to second-guess. Catherine quickly packed what she could carry, stuffing the provisions into her saddlebags. Her father's revolver was still heavy in her holster. The weight of it comforted her, but it also reminded her of the things she had done. She had killed a man. She had killed Jacob Murdoch in cold blood, but it wasn't just cold blood. It was survival. He would have killed her. He had already killed her father. She clenched her jaw, pushing the thought aside. No room for weakness. Not now. As she led Thunder toward the shack's door, a faint noise drifted through the howling wind. A low, steady sound, faint but unmistakable. Hooves. Catherine froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her revolver. She had to make a decision. She could shoot first, ask questions later. But that didn't feel right. She had already killed once. Another life on her conscience? She couldn't afford it. The footsteps grew louder, and she stepped back from the door, pressing her back against the wall, gun raised and ready. The storm outside obscured everything, the white snow and wind swirling in every direction. The rider was close now, the sound of hooves louder than the wind. Whoever it was, they were coming straight for her shelter. A flood of panic surged in her chest, but she forced it down, focusing on the only thing that mattered: survival. Then the knock came. Soft, hesitant, like a man uncertain of his welcome. "Miss Ashford?" The voice was deep, rough, shaped by the biting wind. "My name is Kellen Quinn. I'm not here to hurt you. But you cannot stay here. The men after you are close, and they will find you within a day, storm or no storm." Catherine's heart slammed in her chest. She pressed herself further into the wall, keeping the gun trained on the door. She couldn't trust anyone, not now. She had trusted her father's land, and look where that had gotten her. murdered by a man with more money than justice, with enough power to take what wasn't his. "How do you know my name?" Her voice came out hoarse, sharp with fear. "I know your father," Kellen replied, his voice steady despite the storm. "Tom Ashford. He saved my life once, years ago. I owe him a debt. I heard what happened with Jacob Murdoch. I know what you did. And I know what Murdoch's brother Samuel will do to you if they catch you." There was a pause. "You need to come with me. I'll keep you safe. I'll get you out of here." Catherine felt a sharp pang of something she couldn't name. The snow fell heavier now, the world outside a whirl of white confusion. But here, inside this little shack, the words Kellen spoke held a promise she hadn't dared hope for. Safety. "Let me help you," Kellen continued, his voice rough, but it carried the weight of sincerity. "I know these mountains. I know places they won't think to look. You're not safe here. Let me take you out of this." A strange feeling twisted inside Catherine's chest, a mix of distrust and desperate hope. She kept the revolver raised, but her fingers trembled. She could shoot him. She could put another body on her conscience. Or she could take a risk. "I could shoot you where you stand," she said, her voice low and dangerous, but it lacked the conviction it had had only hours before. "You could," Kellen answered calmly. "But you'd be condemning yourself to die out here alone, in a storm, with men hunting you. I know these mountains. I know routes they won't think to search. I can get you to Wyoming, maybe even further, somewhere you can start over. Or you can shoot me and take your chances." Catherine swallowed, her heart thumping in her chest as she processed his words. She had learned to read men like him growing up, men who wanted something for nothing, men who lied and took what wasn't theirs. But Kellen Quinn was different. He had no reason to lie. And something in his eyes, something raw and honest, made her hesitate. She lowered the gun. Kellen's shoulders relaxed, but his expression didn't soften. "Thank you," he said quietly. "We need to move fast. Samuel Murdoch has a tracker, a man named Red Sky. He'll be after us soon. We need to get north, through the pass, before it's too late." Quote. Catherine nodded, her hand still shaking, but now from something else, something other than fear. The decision had been made. She wasn't alone anymore. Together they prepared the horses, working in quiet, efficient silence. Catherine couldn't explain the sensation of Kellen's presence, the strange comfort of his quiet competence, of knowing he was there, beside her. She had been alone for so long, but now there was something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. As they mounted and rode into the snowstorm, Catherine felt the weight of her decision settle into her bones. She wasn't sure what came next. But for the first time in days, she wasn't running. She was moving forward, and for the first time she had someone at her back. The snowstorm raged on, thick and relentless, as Catherine and Kellen pushed forward into the wilderness. The world around them was a blur of white, with only the faint outlines of trees and rocky outcroppings visible in the storm. Thunder's hooves crunched through the snow, steady and sure, despite the brutal conditions. Kellen's bay horse, Ash, moved alongside them, a silent companion in the storm, as if the mountains themselves had swallowed the world whole. Catherine's face was numb from the cold, and her fingers were stiff inside her gloves. Every breath she took burned in her chest, but still she kept going. There was no choice. The storm would cover their tracks for a time, but it wouldn't last forever. The longer they stayed out here, the more vulnerable they became. Samuel Murdoch would send his men, and the tracker Red Sky wouldn't give up easily. They had to keep moving. Kellen led the way, his back straight and unyielding despite the storm's fury. He seemed to know the land, as well as he knew his own skin, every twist in the trail, every hidden pass, and every secret route that would keep them out of sight. Catherine didn't speak much, her thoughts racing as she clung to the saddle, fighting the cold that threatened to paralyze her. There were too many things she couldn't yet process. Her father was gone. She had killed a man. She was on the run. And now this stranger, this man who had saved her from the storm, was her only chance for survival. She caught herself glancing at him, watching the way he rode with ease, like the wilderness was his home. There was something comforting in the way he moved, steady, confident, and unflinching. It made her feel safer than she had in days, but she couldn't trust him, not completely. She couldn't afford to, not after everything that had happened. Still, she couldn't ignore the small part of her that wanted to, the part that wished she could trust someone again. She had learned early on that trust was a luxury people couldn't afford in the West. But Kellen, there was something different about him. He didn't look at her like a criminal. He didn't seem scared of her, or worse, scared for her. He looked at her like he saw a person, not a fugitive. The wind howled through the trees, cutting through her coat as if it were made of paper. They had been riding for hours, the only sounds, the rhythm of hooves in the snow and the occasional creak of leather. Catherine's eyes burned from the wind and the snow, but she refused to blink. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, telling her to never stop, never give up, no matter how hard things got. She clung to that memory, the only thing she had left. Finally, Kellen called for a halt. He signaled for Catherine to pull alongside him, his expression tight, his eyes scanning the snow-covered landscape as if looking for something only he could see. "We can't keep pushing this hard," he said, his voice a low growl beneath the wind. "Thunder's getting worn out. We need shelter." Catherine nodded, her throat tight. She hadn't realized how exhausted she was until now. The cold was taking its toll, and the fear of being caught, fear of what would happen if they were, was starting to drag at her limbs like weights. "Do you know where we're going?" she asked, her voice hoarse. The words felt strange on her tongue, like she hadn't spoken in days. "There's a cave up ahead," Kellen said, his tone steady. "I've used it before, and it's sheltered. If we can get there, we can rest. But we can't stay long. We can't risk being found." Catherine glanced behind them, half expecting to see a trail of riders in the distance, but there was nothing. Just snow and more snow. She couldn't see past her own horse, let alone through the storm to find any sign of pursuit. "We'll make it," Kellen added, his voice softer now, as if sensing her unease. "Just keep going." And so they did. The journey to the cave felt like it took an eternity. Catherine's body ached with the cold and the strain of the ride, but Kellen's steady presence beside her kept her from faltering. They rode in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, each facing the storm in their own way. For Catherine, it was a fight to keep her mind from drifting to darker places, to think of what she had done, to think of what was waiting for her if they were caught, to think of how alone she was, despite Kellen's presence. At last, the cave appeared through the swirling snow, a dark shape against the white wilderness. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for their horses to pass through, but it offered shelter from the storm. Kellen led them inside, and Catherine breathed a sigh of relief as the wind was shut out. Inside, the cave was small but deep enough to offer some protection. She dismounted stiffly, her legs barely holding her weight as she stepped inside. Kellen unsaddled both horses quickly, then set about building a fire. The cave was cold, but it was better than the storm outside, and the fire crackled to life quickly, casting warm light on the stone walls. Catherine huddled close, trying to warm herself as the reality of their situation settled over her once again. Kellen moved about with ease, gathering wood for the fire and preparing their supplies. He moved with a quiet efficiency that only added to the feeling that he belonged in the wilderness. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask for permission. He just did what needed to be done, and Catherine found herself watching him, trying to understand him, trying to understand why he was doing this for her. She felt him glance up at her, his blue eyes meeting hers. There was something in his gaze, something that held her attention longer than it should have. It was a kind of unspoken understanding, something she had long ago learned to ignore. But now, in this moment, it felt real. "You're not alone in this, Catherine," Kellen said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "You've got me." The words settled in her chest like a stone. It was too much to ask for, too much to believe. But maybe, just maybe, for the first time in a long time, she didn't have to do everything alone. And for the first time, Catherine let herself believe it. She shifted closer to the fire, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. Outside, the storm howled louder, But inside the cave, with Kellen by her side, she felt something she hadn't felt in days, something resembling peace. They had made it this far. They would make it further. But for now, this was enough. For now, she could rest. The storm continued to rage through the night, howling and battering the small cave with its icy breath. Catherine had never known such cold, not even in the deepest winter days at the ranch, when the wind howled over the mountains like a wolf in search of prey. But here, inside the cave, the fire burned steadily, crackling and popping as they sat in its warmth. Kellen had settled near her, silent and focused, his eyes always moving, scanning the dark corners of their temporary shelter. Catherine sat by the fire, her legs pulled close to her chest. She felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, the kind of weariness that no sleep could fix. The last few days had been a blur, an endless ride through snow, a deadly encounter with the law, and now shelter in the mountains with a man who was a stranger, yet somehow, inexplicably, not. She glanced at Kellen, who had laid his coat over his shoulders like a blanket, his eyes flickering in the firelight. There was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet assurance in everything he did, that made her feel a strange sense of safety, something she hadn't felt in years. "Why are you helping me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Kellen didn't look up right away. His face was shadowed and the firelight flickered across the rough edges of his features. But then, when he did meet her gaze, his eyes were calm. Almost too calm, as if the storm outside didn't matter to him at all. "I owe your father a debt," he said simply. Catherine froze. She hadn't expected that answer. She had heard nothing of her father's past, except the brief stories he'd shared on long nights around the fire, when he was too tired to keep working, too content to keep his eyes open. But this man, Kellen, had a history with him, had known him before everything had gone wrong. "You knew him?" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the sudden rush of emotion she didn't know was there. "I did," Kellen answered, his voice quiet but steady. "A long time ago. Your father saved my life once, Catherine. Pulled me from a flash flood near your ranch, gave me shelter when I had nothing. I'm here because I owe him." Quote. Her heart tightened at the mention of her father, the man who had been everything to her, strong, capable, unwavering. He had been her protector, her guide. And now he was gone, taken from her in a violent flash, leaving behind only memories and blood on the ground. Kellen's words cut through her, a reminder that there had been people in her father's life who cared for him, people who still remembered him. "Thank you," Catherine whispered, feeling the weight of her father's loss press down on her chest. She couldn't explain it. The warmth she felt at Kellen's words, the feeling that maybe, just maybe, not everything in her world had been shattered. He nodded, his gaze shifting away as he stoked the fire. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Ashford. We're not safe here. We need to keep moving." Catherine understood. He was right. They couldn't stay in the cave for long. They couldn't afford to get comfortable, not with Samuel Murdoch's men out there, hunting her down. But still, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something more. A tiny ember of hope in a world that had been too dark for too long. The fire crackled again, sending a shower of sparks into the air. Catherine pulled her knees closer, trying to warm her frozen bones, and thought of what lay ahead. The mountains were only the first part of their journey. Kellen had spoken of heading north, through the mountain passes and into Wyoming, where they could disappear for good. But that meant crossing into even more dangerous territory. It meant being hunted by men who wouldn't hesitate to kill her, just to settle the score. "We have to be careful," Kellen said, his voice drawing her back from her thoughts. "Tomorrow, we head north, through the pass. The storm will help cover our tracks, but it won't last long. We need to stay ahead of them." Catherine nodded, understanding the stakes. "And if they catch us?" "They won't," Kellen replied firmly, his voice sharp with conviction. "Not if we don't let them. I'll keep you safe, Catherine. I promise you that." Quote. Her heart skipped at the words. She didn't know why, but there was something in his tone, in his unwavering belief that they could make it out of this alive, that soothed her in a way she hadn't expected. She had been running for so long, driven by fear and uncertainty, that the idea of safety, real safety, felt like a distant dream. But Kellen's presence felt real. His promise felt real. The fire burned low, and Catherine felt the pull of exhaustion again. She wanted to ask him more, wanted to know who he really was, where he had come from, and why he had chosen to help her. But as she looked at him, his eyes tired, his face shadowed in the flickering light, she knew it wasn't the time. Not yet. They still had a long way to go. "We should sleep," Kellen said, his voice softer now. "We'll need our strength for tomorrow." Catherine nodded again, her eyelids heavy. She settled onto the floor of the cave, wrapping herself in her coat for warmth. The fire crackled softly as Kellen moved to sit against the wall, his back to the cold stone, his eyes never leaving the entrance of the cave. He was keeping watch, as he had promised. Catherine let her eyes drift shut, the sound of the storm outside mingling with the crackling fire, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe. She wasn't alone. She wasn't completely alone, and for the first time in a long time she let herself rest. But sleep didn't come easy. Her mind kept racing, haunted by memories of her father's death, of the blood on her hands, and of the journey ahead. The mountains were unforgiving, and she was no longer sure of anything except the need to survive. And yet, somewhere deep inside her, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't do this without Kellen. As the night stretched on, Catherine finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. The warmth of the fire, the storm outside, and the promise of safety pressing against her in a strange, comforting embrace. Catherine woke with the first light of dawn, the cave still dark, but the air less bitterly cold than it had been the night before. The storm had slowed, but the snow continued to fall in gentle flakes, dusting the world outside with a soft, quiet blanket. She lay still for a moment, listening to the crackle of the fire, the steady rhythm of Kellen's breathing, and the occasional movement from outside, where thunder and ash stood quietly tethered. For a long time, Catherine had lived her life on the edge of fear, always waiting for the next storm, the next betrayal, the next moment that could tear everything apart. But last night, with Kellen beside her, she had slept, truly slept, with no nightmares, no racing thoughts of what might be waiting for her in the next town or in the next dark corner. It felt like a kind of peace, a peace she hadn't known since her father had died. She sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles from the cold. Kellen was already awake, his figure silhouetted against the faint light coming through the mouth of the cave. He was preparing the fire, moving with quiet ease, his back to her as he adjusted their packs. "Morning," Catherine said softly, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. She still felt the chill in her bones, but the fire helped, its warmth comforting against the heavy, oppressive air outside. "Morning," Kellen replied, his voice still rough from sleep. He didn't turn to look at her right away, but his tone was steady, familiar. "The storm's let up. We'll need to move fast today." Catherine nodded, pushing the blankets aside as she rose to her feet. Every part of her screamed to rest, to sleep just a little longer, but she knew Kellen was right. They couldn't afford to linger. Samuel Murdoch's men would be close, and the longer they stayed in one place, the more likely they were to be found. After a few minutes of silence, Kellen turned to her, his eyes assessing, but kind. "How are you holding up?" The question caught her off guard, and for a moment Catherine didn't know how to answer. She had been running for so long, had fought for her survival every day since her father's death, that she didn't know how to admit what was happening now, what was beginning to change. "I'm all right," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. She pulled her gloves on, trying to ignore the way her fingers still trembled. "We can't stay here, though." "No," Kellen agreed, glancing at the cave entrance. "But we've got a little more time. Let's get some food in us and then move out. We'll make it through the pass today if the weather holds." Catherine helped pack their things, the motion mechanical, her thoughts focused on the task in front of her. The simple rhythm of working together, of preparing for the day ahead, gave her a sense of control in a world that felt increasingly out of her hands. As they saddled their horses and prepared to leave the shelter of the cave, the cold hit her again, sharp and biting, but it no longer felt as overwhelming. It was just another challenge to face. As they rode out, Catherine couldn't help but look back at the cave, the last semblance of safety she'd had since escaping Canon City. She didn't know when or if she would find a place like that again. but she didn't have time to think about it now. They had to keep moving. The trail ahead was winding, the snow packed underfoot by their horses' hooves. The mountains loomed high around them, towering like silent sentinels, blocking out the sky. Catherine kept her eyes on the path, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She couldn't get used to the silence between her and Kellen, but there was something comforting about it. He didn't push her to talk, didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. Still, as the hours passed, she found herself watching him more than she should. There was something about him, the way he moved, the way he knew these mountains, the way he carried himself as though he had nothing to fear from the world, and that made him all the more powerful in her eyes. At some point, Kellen slowed down, bringing their horses to a stop near a small outcropping of rock. He raised a hand to signal her to hold up, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" Catherine asked, her heart quickening. "Tracks," Kellen said, his voice tight. He leaned forward, studying the snow carefully. "Someone's been here recently." "Not long ago." Catherine's stomach twisted. Her hand instinctively reached for her gun, but she stayed still, her eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. Kellen's gaze never left the snow. "We're not far enough ahead. We've got to move faster." She nodded, not needing him to say more. "How do we get around them?" Quote, "We take the long route," Kellen said, standing up in his stirrups to scan the horizon. "We cut west through the hills. It'll slow us down, but it'll keep us off the main trail." The decision was made quickly, and they turned their horses toward the hills. Catherine felt her heart race again, the pressure mounting as the thought of being tracked by Red Sky and Murdoch's men lingered in her mind. Every step, every choice could mean the difference between freedom and capture. For a while, there was nothing but the crunch of snow beneath their horses' hooves and the wind biting at their faces. The farther they rode, the more isolated they became. No sound but the howling of the wind and the whisper of snow. Catherine's thoughts drifted back to the day she had pulled the trigger, the moment Jacob Murdoch's life had ended in the same brutal way her father's had. The weight of it still lingered on her shoulders, and she wondered how long it would be before it crushed her completely. "We'll make it," Kellen said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. She looked at him, his face set in grim determination. She didn't answer, but something in his gaze, the quiet strength he exuded, made her believe it. For the first time in days, maybe longer, Catherine allowed herself to hope again. By nightfall, they reached a narrow pass in the mountains. The snow had let up somewhat, but the temperature had dropped, and the air was sharp and biting. They made camp by a small stream, where Kellen quickly set up a fire, its warm glow cutting through the darkness. As they sat by the fire, sharing the meager rations they had left, Catherine found herself asking the question that had been on her mind for hours, maybe longer. "Why did you help me?" she asked again, her voice softer this time. Kellen looked at her, his gaze steady, and for a long moment there was silence. Then he spoke, his voice low but filled with something deep, something true. "I'm not the kind of man who lets someone go through this alone. And I made a promise to your father. I can't break it." Catherine nodded, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. The fire crackled softly between them, and for a fleeting moment, the storm outside seemed to retreat. The night passed slowly, the wind howling around them like a restless spirit. The fire crackled, and Catherine stared into its flames, the glow illuminating her tired face. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but sleep had eluded her once again. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of those she'd left behind, the moments of violence and fear that had led her to this life on the run. The guilt clung to her like a second skin, but there was something else now, something that had started to shift in her heart since meeting Kellen. He had promised to keep her safe, and though the storm outside was fierce and the path ahead uncertain, there was a part of her that began to believe it. He hadn't flinched when she lowered her gun. He hadn't asked her to explain, hadn't judged her for what she had done. All he had offered was a way forward, and for the first time, Catherine found herself thinking about what life could be after all this, what she might build, where she might go, and who she might become. But that hope was fragile, and she held it close, careful not to let it break under the weight of what lay ahead. There was still so much uncertainty. The following morning dawned gray and bitterly cold, the snow continuing to fall in soft, endless flakes. Catherine and Kellen rose early, their movements synchronized as they packed up camp and prepared their horses. There was no time for rest. They had made it through the night, but they couldn't stay here long. The sooner they moved, the further ahead of the Murdoch men they would be. As they rode into the morning light, the landscape around them was a blur of white. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, the peaks lost in the storm. But Kellen seemed to know where he was going, his eyes scanning the snow-covered trail with an almost uncanny certainty. Catherine followed, her mind still preoccupied with the events that had led them here. The cold wind stung her face as they pushed on, but this time she was more prepared. She felt the weight of Kellen's presence beside her, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. Even when the snow was blinding, even when the world felt as though it was closing in on her, Kellen kept her grounded, his steady rhythm, a reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. They rode through the day in silence, the journey grueling but necessary. The mountains grew steeper, the trails narrower, and Catherine's body ached with every movement. But she kept going. She had no choice. As they neared the edge of the pass, the snow began to ease, the winds dying down, leaving a quiet stillness in their wake. Catherine glanced up, her eyes catching the faint outline of a distant ridge. They were almost there, almost to the safety of Wyoming territory. But that thought was quickly cut off by the sound of something much closer, a distant shout. Catherine's heart raced, and she glanced at Kellen. His jaw was set, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the ridges around them. "They've found us," he said quietly, the words colder than the air around them. "Red Sky's tracker must have picked up our trail." Catherine's stomach dropped. She could feel it now. The weight of being hunted, the terrible reality of running for her life. They couldn't outrun them forever. "We need to move, fast," Kellen continued, his voice firm with authority. "Head for the ridge. I know a place they won't think to look." Catherine didn't argue. They kicked their horses into motion, pushing them harder as the trail grew more treacherous, the rocks jutting out like sharp teeth. Catherine's thoughts raced as they moved, her mind spinning with the weight of everything that had happened, everything that could still happen. They reached the ridge quickly, and Kellen led them down a narrow, twisting path that wound through the rocks and trees, hidden from view. It was a dangerous route, but it was their only chance. Kellen kept them moving at a quick pace, his eyes never straying from the trail ahead. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a small hollow surrounded by dense trees, their branches heavy with snow. Kellen dismounted first, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of pursuit. He motioned for Catherine to follow, and they quickly tethered the horses to a nearby tree. "We stay here," Kellen said, his voice low but determined. "We wait for nightfall. Then we head north. If we're lucky, they won't find us." Catherine nodded, trying to steady her breath. The hollow offered them some cover, but it wasn't a perfect hiding place. If Red Sky was as good as Kellen said, they couldn't afford to relax. Kellen sat down on a nearby rock, his gaze distant as he seemed to consider their next move. Catherine stayed close, her eyes constantly darting to the shadows, her mind still racing. "How long do we have?" she asked, breaking the silence. "A few hours, maybe," Kellen replied. "But we need to be ready. Once the sun sets, we move." The quiet tension between them grew, neither speaking, both listening for any sign that they were being followed. The world around them was silent, the snow covering every sound, making it impossible to hear anything coming until it was too late. As the hours passed, the light began to fade, and Catherine could feel the weight of the moment settle in. The night was coming, they would move soon. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the promise Kellen had made, to keep her safe. She couldn't let herself believe in it, not completely. She had lost too much, trusted too many people who had turned their backs. But with Kellen, she felt something different. His presence was a quiet strength she hadn't known she needed, and despite everything, despite the fear and uncertainty, a part of her wanted to believe that they could make it out of this together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Kellen rose to his feet, his movements quick and efficient. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable but steady. Time to move. They mounted their horses once more, their breath visible in the cold air as they began the journey north. Catherine's heart raced in her chest, but it wasn't fear that she felt now. It was something else, something deeper, something that had started when she'd first met Kellen Quinn. Hope. They rode through the night, the snow-covered world around them a blur of white and gray. With each step, with each mile, they drew closer to the safety of Wyoming. And with each passing moment, Catherine knew, more surely than anything else, that the promise Kellen had made was one he would keep. And for the first time in a long time, Catherine believed in the future.